In the early hours of the morning on January 1st, 1990, a young man comes home from a night out of heavy drinking. New Year's Eve has always been a spectacle in the city of Copenhagen, and the man has been out celebrating the turn of the decade with his friends. His girlfriend, Hanne, is a drug user. Earlier in the night, they had gone to the central train station to buy some heroin and spent some time in one of the heated rooms outside the station where other drug addicts would gather to shelter from the cold. But at some point before midnight, Hanne decided to go make some money they could spend on partying. She is a sex worker, which her boyfriend has always reluctantly tolerated. Their plan is for her to bring a guy back to their apartment, then rejoin their group later on. But Hanne has not returned. It's been hours. So after he is too tired to wait for her anymore, the boyfriend takes the bus back across the city, then immediately goes to their apartment. The guy doesn't have his keys on him. Luckily, he is able to get a neighbor to let him into the building, but when he reaches their floor, he finds the front door locked. He knocks, then knocks again, but there is no response, so he gets anxious. He is probably concerned for her, but he's likely also fueled by hours of consuming an ungodly combination of narcotics and alcohol. But little does he realize that what he is about to discover will haunt him for the rest of his life. After he kicks the door in, he immediately comes upon a horrifying scene. Hanne's naked body is stretched out across the floor. She is covered in blood, and it's obvious that she has been dead for hours. While he immediately feels a sickening pit in his stomach, the boyfriend runs to get help. But he likely doesn't understand that this discovery marks the start of a case that would take more than 30 years to reach a conclusion. Today, I'm going to explore the brutal murder of Hanne, who on New Year's Eve 1989 is killed by a man who manages to evade the authorities for decades until advances in DNA processing are finally able to identify him. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel. It's honestly the easiest way to help us. And if you have any other stories in mind that you would like me to explore in future episodes, feel free to leave a comment beneath. But for now, let's get on with today's story. Hanne is born on May 9th, 1966. And from the moment she takes her first breath, she already doesn't have an easy life. She is only 2 years old when her 16-year-old teenage mother kills herself. Hanne then spends her childhood in a number of orphanages before finally being taken in by a lady named Bitten. But whatever sliver of stability this home offers her, it's not enough to keep her out of trouble. In her own teens, she starts doing petty crimes, and she also begins taking narcotics. As the story so often goes, this inevitably forces her to find ways of funding her abuse. To this day, prostitution is legal in Denmark. I'm not sure when exactly Hanne started her life as a sex worker, but by her early 20s, she routinely would make money this way. She did find herself in a serious relationship at one time, and she even got married to this man. But from what the papers later said, her husband, who hadn't been aware of her sex work, had discovered this soon after their wedding and immediately left her. Hanne then begins a relationship with the guy she was with at the time of her murder. This boyfriend is indeed familiar with her secrets, but evidently he accepts her choices, and he even agrees for her to take guys back to their shared apartment at times. On New Year's Eve 1989, Hanne is out partying in the city of Copenhagen with this boyfriend. Like I mentioned in the intro, they meet up with some friends at the central train station, and Hanne and some of the other women in the group decide to do some drugs. What exactly they did for the next couple of hours is not entirely clear, and maybe it's not essential to her story when you consider the way her murder eventually transpired. But what is essential is that during the dark and frigid night, she decides to sell herself and make some money. At the time, the shady area around the train station is the hub of sex work in the city, and especially the area near Helmtorvet forms a red light district. A taxi driver later recalls driving a man to the area because he had mentioned he decided to pick up a hooker. They passed by a woman who matched Hanne's description near the intersection of Skelbækgade and Sønder Boulevard, and after the guy in the back seat had talked to her, she joined them in the taxi. This woman then told the driver to take them to a street called Fensmarkgade. Other than the killer, this taxi driver is supposedly the last person to see Hanne alive. At one point later in the night, another cab driver reports that he picked up a man near the intersection of Tagensvej and Mimersgade, which is only a short walk from Hanne apartment in Fensmarkgade. The driver remembered that the guy had spoken with a very proper Danish dialect, and he had asked him to take him to the Valby train station, evidently to catch a train out of the city. Meanwhile, in the early hours of the morning, Hanne's boyfriend returns to their apartment. It's easy to imagine him being drunk and tired and ready to simply pass out and sleep soundly well into the next day, as he forces his way in and closes the door behind him. But again, the scene he comes upon would have been immediately sobering. Hanne is lying in a pool of blood, her throat has been sliced, and she has multiple stab wounds from a Phillips head screwdriver and a hacksaw. She also looks like she's been suffocated, likely with a torn out electric cord later recovered in the home. And the autopsy confirms the next day that her death is at least partially caused by asphyxiation. The police question both taxi drivers and Hanne's boyfriend, but in the months to come, they never managed to solve the murder, and the boyfriend who had found the body is also cleared of any culpability. Let me quickly mention something. Back in the 80s, my own parents lived in an apartment in Fensmarkgade. They later purchased the house that would become my childhood home, and by 1989, they had moved out. But for a number of years, they lived in Fensmarkgade number 38, immediately across from Hanne's apartment in number 39. From their home, they could see directly into Hanne's living room. If they had still lived in the building, they and my sister would have woken up on January 1st, 1990, as the oblivious neighbors to one of the most horrifying crime scenes imaginable. Murder cases in Denmark do not provide a legal statute of limitations, which is also the case in many other countries. This means that recent years have seen a number of high-profile crimes solved after their trail had gone cold decades earlier. In Sweden, they had their own example of this in 2020 when a man named Daniel Nyqvist was arrested 16 years after the murders of Mohammed Amouri and Anna-Lena Svensson. The decision to charge him was made after a DNA sample from the crime scene was matched to him by using an online genealogy database. Of course, in the United States, there's been a number of similar stories. In 2018, the FBI arrested a man named Joseph James D'Angelo after his DNA had similarly been matched to samples from a crime scene, using the same method of searching through websites aimed at ancestral research. Suddenly, the horrifying case of a serial killer active for over 20 years had been solved, and the man who had been known in the media as the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker had finally been identified. In 2002, the Copenhagen police took another look at Hanne's case. DNA technology had seen significant improvements in the years after her murder in 1989. They compared samples found on her pants to their DNA registry, but at the time it didn't yield any results. 21 years later, however, everything would change. In 2023, forensic geneticists with the University of Copenhagen conducted another search in the registry of DNA samples collected by the authorities, and this time, they found a match. In the year 2000, a law was passed in Denmark that enabled the police to set up a centralized registry of DNA profiles, but they were only permitted to collect samples from people who were charged with crimes that could result in prison sentences of over more than 18 months. That means this registry had only existed for 2 years when the police tried to find a DNA match in 2002, so there were really not many profiles to explore. But by 2023, someone's profile had indeed been added, whom studies indicated could be the son of the person who had left the DNA traces on Hennevid's pants. While the approach of solving an old case mobilizing genealogical data meant for ancestral research sounds very similar to how the authorities solved Hennevid's murder, the Danish police is not actually currently permitted to employ this method. They didn't search public databases. They only referenced their own DNA registry. But luckily, it had given them the lead they had been desperately needing for over 30 years. The match indicated the sample was 100 times more likely to be from this person than anyone else. On February 6, 2024, A 53-year-old man is at work at an industrial slaughterhouse near the city of Ranas. It's early in the day as he goes about his usual tasks, but suddenly his life is immediately changed when the facility is surrounded by the cops. That day, Henrik Krogh Rasmussen is arrested and charged with a crime he supposedly committed 34 years prior. Henrik's son is the person whom the DNA sample from Hanne's clothing had indicated was likely related to the killer. The son's profile had been entered into the registry in 2019 after he had himself been charged with sexual misconduct. Of course, in Danish, this is a specific charge that may result in prison sentences of up to 2 years. While the son had only been given a fine, the cops had legally collected a DNA sample from him because the sexual misconduct allegation met the minimum requirement for entry into their centralized registry. It later came out that Hanne's case was one of a number of cases selected when the authorities decided to run a trial of deploying this genealogical data to re-examine unsolved cases. But some people have criticized the cops for not employing this method earlier. The son's profile had been added to the database in 2019, which means the case could have been solved as much as 5 years earlier. If the killer had passed away in the course of those 5 years, prosecutors would have not been able to bring him to justice. The Copenhagen police decided to brief the press the day after the arrest to inform the public about the surprising development in the case. They mentioned for the first time that a person had called them on October 7th of 1991, so more than a year and a half after the murder. This person had suspected a former colleague of being responsible for Hanne's death. Supposedly around the time of the murder on New Year's Eve, 1989, the person this man suspected had been in Copenhagen for a course at a vocational school to train as a butcher. After his arrest, the police explored the possibility of Henrik being behind similar unsolved murders. A couple of sex workers, for example, had been killed in the city of Randers in the year 2000. There had been a number of suspects in this case, but while the killer left behind a large amount of DNA traces, the murders had never been solved. Henrik's DNA, however, did not provide a match, so this investigation was quickly closed. Henrik Krogh Rasmussen was charged with murder the day after his arrest. The belief is that Hanne had met her demise sometime between the hours of 1:15 and 2:10 on January 1st, 1990. The original autopsy had indicated she had been beaten, kicked, and stabbed with a screwdriver, after which she had been suffocated. Henrik, meanwhile, pleaded not guilty. He claimed that around the end of 1989, he had been serving in the military and he had been stationed at Holmen in the Copenhagen harbor. Back then he had been 19 years old, and he and a friend went to drink on New Year's Eve at a music venue called Ledes Kælder in the city. His buddy, however, had left before Henrik, and subsequently the young man had continued to drink on his own. He eventually got very intoxicated, after which he claimed to have gone straight home to sleep. He denied having engaged the services of a sex worker that night, and he claimed to have never been anywhere near Hanne's apartment in Finsmarkgade. Henrik also claimed he didn't know anything about the red light district in Copenhagen. The prosecutors, on the other hand, offered the theory that a conflict had started after Hanne and Henrik had arrived at her apartment. When the home was searched, a bag with 400 Danish kroner was found behind a gas meter, and one of Hanne's friends said that it corresponded with the amount she would normally charge people for having sex with them. They believed the killer had searched her apartment after murdering her in an attempt to find this money. Just a quick warning. I'm about to go over some of the more gruesome details from the crime scenes, so if you are sensitive to stories of sexual violence, this would be a good time to skip ahead to the next chapter. Henrik eventually changed his story. While he denied having killed her, he did admit that he had been in Hanne's apartment on the night of her murder, although he also claimed to have no memory of what happened there. Supposedly, he had taken a number of different drugs, which included marijuana, coke, and speed. He denied that he had ever paid anyone for sex, but a former friend of his testified that Henrik had gone to see a sex worker at least one time before. The friend knew this because he had been with him. Hanne's apartment had been rummaged through, and traces of blood had been left in a number of places. She had been found naked, lying on her back, with her left arm extended backwards and her legs spread apart. Her throat had been partially cut as she had a 4-inch lesion across her neck, and next to her on the ground was her wallet. Over the course of the trial, the prosecutors recounted the witness statement from the taxi driver, who reported having picked up a man and later a woman matching Hanne's description. Like I mentioned earlier, he had taken them to her home in Fensmarkgade, and interestingly, he described the man as sober and reasonable, although he had also seemed very excitable. This taxi driver had unfortunately passed away over the years, so he was unable to provide any additional details. When it came to closing arguments, the prosecutor focused on the detailed explanation that Henrik had provided. Having blacked out on drugs seemed like an overly convenient excuse, and he had never managed to satisfactorily explain why his DNA was found at the crime scene. The prosecutor, Søren Harbo, would go on to say, "My conclusion is that I don't believe he's telling the truth. He definitely remembers having killed Henrik. He wasn't as drunk as he says he was. He just can't get himself to admit his horrible actions this many years later." The prosecutor decided to pursue a sentencing which resembled the standard back in 1990, which for a crime of this nature most often resulted in about 12 years in prison. The defense, which was led by a famous Danish attorney called Mette Grits, remained focused on the fact that Henrik still didn't admit to remembering the actual murder, but also that his DNA and fingerprints were never found on any of the alleged murder weapons recovered at the apartment. They also argued that the fact that he had not committed any crimes in the 30 years that had passed since the murder should speak in his favor and suggest that a lesser punishment was adequate. Henrik had decided to be tried by a judge instead of a jury, and in the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to 11.5 years. He requested some time to consider whether or not to appeal the ruling, but in the end, he decided to not do so, and his attorney would later comment, "My client just wants to start serving his sentence as soon as possible. Him and his family just want to move on." The final hours of Henrik's life obviously remained a mystery for over 30 years. But the reality is, this case is fairly simple. The substantial amount of DNA samples left behind by Henrik Krogh Rasmussen at the crime scene honestly leaves no doubt that he was guilty of the murder back on New Year's Eve 1989. On a side note, Hanne's murder happened the same night as the mass shooting in Narsaq in Greenland. If you're a subscriber to this channel, you may remember that I explored this case in a previous episode. Either way, I will put a link to it here if you're curious to learn more about it. But when I was going over old Danish articles as I was preparing this story, it was a lot easier to find information on Hanne's case than the incident in Greenland. After all, the massacre in Greenland unfolded in a small isolated hamlet thousands of miles away, while Hanne was murdered in the middle of a busy city in an area many families called home. This is it for today's story. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe. Your support means a lot to me. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thank you for watching.